We now move on to World War One, which obviously began in 1914. Now, World War One was really a worldwide event. However, it's also an extremely important aspect of Australian history because it's often believed to be the place where Australia's national identity was born. Australia was dragged into World War One by Britain, obviously because Australia still really relied on Britain at that time and really saw Britain as what we call the mother country. So Australia was like Britain's child, and Australia really felt a need to help Britain during the war. So young men left Australia, they hurried across to Europe to get the adventure of the war, and also the idea that social pressure was pressuring them to go to war because, all their friends were signing up, so they decided to sign up. However, once they got to the war, they found a really grim reality. And obviously World War One is one of the darkest chapters of the world's history. Australians, however, really triumphed under fire, and they achieved a tough reputation on the battlefield. They were really seen as hardy, as survivors, as resourceful people who were always cheerful even under the worst circumstances. So they were nicknamed the Digger. The Diggers were basically because in World War One, they dug these huge trenches where they would live and fight out of. So digging them gave them that nickname. We then move to the issue of the 1920s. Now, leaving behind the awful time of World War One, Australia really saw the 1920s as a time to move on and get a bit of culture going in Australia. It was a time of celebration and of happiness, obviously, because the war was entirely over. So this led to a period of decadence and growth. So what we mean by this is that the culture was booming, it was a generally prosperous and rich country, and basically everyone had a high standard of living and a really good lifestyle. For example, at this time, the first Australian cars were starting to being distributed throughout Australia. So the Ford car was becoming accessible to Australians. Now, looking at the traffic on the roads today, it's almost impossible to imagine that about 80 years ago there weren't any cars at all in Australia. However, the 1920s is the first time that these cars appeared. We also had our airline established. So I'm sure many of you have been on Qantas planes before, and this is the time when Qantas was developed. We also had a wide spread of culture. So for example, the ballet became extremely popular in Australia, and particular art movements such as Cubism and Modernism spread throughout Australia as they came across from Europe. So at this time, we were really moving on from a very basic Australian bush culture, a very simple lifestyle, to one which was quite culturally renowned and one which was extremely interesting to be a part of. We then move on to the Great Depression. Now, this began in 1929, and this brought an abrupt end to the great times of the 1920s. Basically, what happened is that when the American stock market crashed, this led to effects on Australia because Australia and the rest of the world was so dependent on American spending. So many Australians lost their jobs and were evicted from their homes. This also meant that people rarely had shoes, blankets, or enough food. And many people became extremely sick at this time due to the fact that people simply couldn't afford doctors and couldn't afford medicine. A lot of fathers left their families in order to go to the country to try to find work. People were absolutely desperate for work at this time. They would almost do anything just if it meant to get some food on their family's table. At this time also, due to the hardships, this is when the first Communist Party formed in Australia. So that was a direct response to the hardships and therefore the people saying, life shouldn't be like this, how can we make our life better? And their response was the Communist Party. Also at this time was the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, this bridge, which had been built for a number of years, was finally completed during this decade and provided an opportunity for Sydney to meet. Because as you know, the big separation of the north and south of Sydney had previously meant that it was extremely difficult to travel between the parts of Sydney. This bridge opened a whole new opportunity for Sydney to really be travelled by everyone and anyone. We then move on to World War II. Now, Australia was in the war for financial reasons. They felt that the war could bring them prosperity through the fact that by building ties with other countries, they could later benefit economically. And also those same ties with Britain, which we discussed. Australia just felt a sense of loyalty and a desire to help out their old ally. What this meant was that troops in Papua New Guinea and the Pacific, Australian troops were placed there to fight against the Japanese. This is where Australians for the first time were really fighting on their own in the Pacific. They weren't necessarily all in Europe with the British and the French, but they were on their own for the very first time. At this time, while they were in Papua New Guinea, obviously in war, the shortage of nurses led to this group of people called the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. Now, obviously, this is a really strange name, but what it basically meant was that the Pacific Islander people were really seen as heroes in that during the war, they were rescuing the Australian people who were injured in the jungles of Papua New Guinea while they were living in the war conditions. So these became really an issue of hero and an element of Australia's national identity, which we've always been thankful for. America also became a significant part of Australia's history at this point, due to the fact that Australia was saved from being invaded by America's intervention. And this led to the treaty which is called ANZUS. So ANZUS, which stands for A, Australia, NZ, New Zealand, and US, America, the United States, really meant that the relationship between these three countries was now formal and documented. So for the first time, Australia is thinking, I'm not looking to Britain anymore, now we're going to look to America.